Introduction. The human mind is designed to be part of a collective. As sophisticated as it is designed to be malleable by its surroundings. That is a necessary condition for survival, malleability. A mind that is rigid will not be able to adapt to the changing environment. Imagine if a tree can only survive with sunshine the whole year. What happens in the winter? It dies. But what happens if that tree adapted to the climate, shed its leaves, and hibernated for the winter? It will survive and return in the spring. But the tree that didn't adapt to the change in season will wither and perish. For the same reason, the mind has evolved to observe and adapt to its surroundings. It is able to detect the changes and the status of the world around it, and then to socialize, learn, experiment, and mimic. Mimicry and influence are two sides of the same coin. It is how we broadcast and receive intangible mindsets that determine everything from how we behave, how we think, what we choose, how we speak, and so many more things that it is hard to believe that our so-called free will is not really free will. When we adopt an idea or a method from someone else, we mimic them. When they follow us, we influence them. In some areas of life, we influence. In many areas, we mimic, and that creates a class of influencers and a class of followers. This is normal. It is how a society forms. It is how our species and a number of other species behave. It is how we advance our primary purpose. The purpose of the human species is to survive. The way it survives is to consume energy and nutrients, shelter itself from adverse elements, both physical and psychological, and create offspring so that it can extend from one generation to the next. In short, to live and thrive along the unfolding of time, we have to roll with the punches, and because our mind is the organ that determines that, our mind is naturally built to adapt. That adaptive quality has significant advantages. It allows societies to build in numbers and take on characteristics of their own. Have you ever been to a city and see the way the people are, and go to a different city and find that the people there are totally different? The first time that became apparent to me was when I started traveling as a teenager, and I found that people were fundamentally different based on the country and city they lived in. Even in the U.S., you still see that today. New Yorkers behave differently from Californians. The North marches to a different beat than the South. And Middle America is different from Coastal America. The region, it turns out, molds us as much as we mold it. Advantages aside, that malleability comes at a cost if we are not careful. In the world of psychographics, subliminal persuasion, and the influencer-follower relationship, the intent of the influencer deserves greater scrutiny, because it is not always that the influencer is interested in overall good, and sometimes is motivated by pure self-gain. We will come back to this later. The other element of human character that is relevant to this topic is the fact that our fundamental nature of community is driven by equity. Equity is the fairness that determines the exchange of value. If a kid mows your lawn, you give him $50. When you work for your company, you are paid a just wage. You get the point. The principle of equity also covers the influencer-follower exchange. Look at it in modern terms. There are online influencers who are out there to evangelize the products they represent. In doing that, they highlight all the issues that are important to us about a product, and in return they are rewarded with a commission on sales or wages. The exchange is equitable. Equity is the measure that is planted in the depths of our consciousness. We tend to understand what is fair and what is not. What is not within us is the empathy in sufficient quantities to project that balance of equity to our counterpart and see the equation from their perspective. In this scenario, it creates the possibility for us to push the boundaries and shortchange others. Let me be clear. Equity is not about equality. Equality is a different matter and not related to equity, especially in the context of value exchange. Equity is also something that is highly individual, and imposing our individual equity onto others is not wise. Think of it this way. A worker in China spends his day in a clothing factory earning $1 per day stitching hundreds of garments over the course of a month. We here in the U.S. would not even consider that to be acceptable and may even view it as slave labor. But for the worker, he is more than happy to do it because it gives him a job to support himself and his family, no matter how humble the lifestyle. His alternative would be no job and life on the streets. Thus, what we consider equitable is not equitable for them. This is a simple example to illustrate the point. Or think about it this way. To be competitive, you lower your bid to beat out the higher-priced competitor. So you win the bid and now you have the job, but it is worth less. Is that considered inequitable? No. So you see, it's not the dollar value that determines equity. It is the aggregate of the elements that make up your situation, and that is a very personal and individual circumstance. When someone robs another of that equity, there are two possible reasons. The first possibility is that the former's aggressive stance overpowers the latter's in the normal course of negotiation. The second is that the former intentionally brings external factors to bear in the execution of the negotiation. For example, two people negotiate the sale of land. The seller, armed with his own definition of equity, wants a certain consideration. The buyer, armed with his definition of equity, wants something different. The two negotiate and go back and forth, and eventually a balance is struck. However, if the buyer kidnaps the seller's child and demands a more advantageous price as consideration, he has brought in an external factor and tilted the scales of equity. He has used a powerful element of fear to sway the normal course of equitable negotiation. Aside from being distasteful, it is of course illegal, but it is just used here as an example. This external element to tilt the scales of equity is typically related to one of the motivating factors of the human species, primarily fear. We will look at fear in a little more detail later in the book. But for now, you must understand that fear is a key motivator in a lot of the things that we do. Whether that fear is warranted or it is a misfire in our synapses, the result is the same. We move fervently to correct the situation that triggers that fear, and if that is not possible, we cut off the feeling or the sense that is responsible for triggering that fear. It's like being in a plane and an alarm or warning triggers. If you can't fix it, at least disengage the alarm so that it stops distracting you. The same thing happens here. We have looked at three elements thus far: influence, equity, and fear. We can see why all are necessary for the proper functioning of our species and the functioning of our individual self. So how does emotional manipulation fit in with all this? The three elements we briefly touched on and introduced are natural parts of your psyche and physiology. Emotional manipulation occurs when the influencer applies undue methods, like fear, to get the victim to commit an act that is not equitable, in part or completely. That's the simple definition, but it carries a lot of baggage that deserves to be expanded on and explained. That is, in part, what I shall do over the course of this book. Chapter 1. Introduction to Emotional Manipulation. Emotional manipulation is the use of emotion, particularly fear, to do something against your will, but you are stuck in an untenable position, and you know that you will feel horrible for doing something that is in your best interest if it goes against another person's wishes. Just as you can be subject to emotional manipulation, it is also possible that you unwittingly subject your loved ones or someone close to you, or even a stranger if your gravity is strong enough, to emotional manipulation. This book is going to look at the subject from both ends of the spectrum, from the person who manipulates knowingly for his own ends to the person who manipulates without realizing it and not for his own benefit. The manipulation framework. The manipulation framework is a theoretical profile that can be used to get a better grasp of the subject matter. It gives a three-dimensional perspective of three key elements in emotional manipulation, and on the severity of the situation and the distinction between an equitable situation and an accidental one. Intent. Imagine this to be the first axis, and it is laid out horizontally. It makes up the first dimension of manipulation, and it has to do with the intent and knowledge of the manipulator. Intent of the aggressor is a key factor in this, and the intention is not to explicitly premeditate the manipulation of the victim, but rather the intent defines the willingness to take advantage of a person without regard to the person's eventual state. I believe we should always leave a person with the same equity we find them in, or better. Most times, if done right, relationships yield synergies that result in both parties better off than they would have been had they never partook in the relationship. But this is ideal, and in many scenarios, one party is always left holding the chaff and the other party walks away with the wheat. Coming back to the role of intent on manipulation, whether someone intends to manipulate you or otherwise is immaterial. You have to look at it and ask yourself if you are manipulating someone or you are being manipulated by someone. In this scenario, identifying the manipulation gets harder and determining the intent behind it gets more obscure. Relationship. Now imagine the second axis that measures the relationship between the parties. Think of it as the vertical axis, and one end measures the closeness of the manipulator and the victim. One end of the spectrum is that the two are strangers, like two people who just met. And the other end is where they have known each other for ages, are likely married or living together, might even be related, as in filial manipulation. There is evidence that mothers tend to be emotionally manipulative over one or more of their daughters in different ways. Gravity. The third axis that rounds out the matrix gives real insight and puts us on the path to a solution to the whole thing, and that is the gravity of the manipulation. Gravity is not about the strength of the manipulation. It is about the initiating source. It is often taken for granted that the manipulator is the initiator of the problem and the victim is the helpless target. That is not always the case. There are cases where the same person is manipulated wherever he or she goes and is the victim of various manipulators. In cases like this, you should start to question the victim, and when you do, you start to identify the traits that go into the profile of a victim. You will see that sometimes victims have so much gravity that they seek out and attract manipulators or they make a person manipulate them. So when you look at a situation where one is manipulating the other, you cannot just jump to the conclusion that the victim has nothing to do with it. Some victims find their strength in being a victim. It is their own psychology, and in some cases, it may be an unhealthy relationship, and in other cases, both parties get what they want. One gets to be in control and extract benefit, and the other gets to be the martyr. Having said that, I must address the issue that some people might think that I am about to place blame of the emotional manipulation on the victim and reduce the burden of responsibility of the belligerent. That is not the case at all. What it is done for is to highlight the realities that a prospective victim might exhibit or the ways an unwitting manipulator might take on. After all, human beings, sociopathic or empathic, are driven by the balance of interaction and selfish purpose of self-betterment. It is a natural tendency that goes overboard and becomes unhealthy. In the case of an overbearing manipulator, this selfish desire has taken an unhealthy turn, and in the case of the unrealizing victim, they have the mistaken notion that they have nothing else to offer in turn for what they want, be it a misguided expression of care or the misguided definition of love. Intervention. The three axes listed form the framework of an emotionally manipulative relationship. Those who see it in aggressors would intervene and highlight it to them lest they are not aware. And those who see it in victims certainly should bring it up because the victims are definitely unaware of their behavior and their options. Getting out of this dynamic starts with the recognition of the matter, followed by a self-reflective analysis of the factors at play, and ending with the courage to make the necessary decisions. If you are the person doing the analysis and are part of the relationship, it is best to start with yourself rather than the shortcomings of your counterpart. If you are an outsider looking in, then you should look carefully at the dynamic at play before you offer any advice. External advice, beyond telling the aggressor or the victim that there is emotional manipulation at play, should not be taken lightly, and once the decision is made to voice it, it should be strictly limited to making it known. What to do and how you go about it should be avoided. The unintended consequence of stressing the matter too much can be disastrous. So tread carefully. Remember constantly that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Your good intentions may make things worse than they already are. Advancing the manipulation framework. With that said, it is time to dive into the 3 axes of emotional manipulation and find where any instance of manipulation sits within that framework. The reason we want to use this framework will become clear as we proceed. But for those of you who already get the idea, you will see that the more close the relationship, the closer the intersection of the 3 factors, and the more gravity that is displayed, the more it moves forward. And the more right it moves in terms of intent, where the aggressor is impressing more intention to extract benefit from the victim, the more to the right the intersection moves. This quadrant is the most obvious, and those in this quadrant will most likely already know it in their hearts that manipulation is afoot or has a high probability of settling into the relationship. Why should it be understood in these terms? Because manipulation is complex, and you need to start with a framework that is not biased and one that gets you started on the right road. If you just happen to fall into manipulation, or you are just finding out because your instincts are telling you so, or a friend has alerted you to the matter, then you need a good framework to wrap your head around the issue. So with that, let's start with the first axis of intent. The 2 extremes of this axis, as you can imagine, are that of total ignorance of the fact or total premeditation of it. It is completely possible that a person is ignorant of the fact that they are being manipulated, and it is also totally possible that a person does it without realizing it. Manipulation is the extension of getting what you want from a person when you believe that they are not going to easily give it up. Who among us has not been guilty of getting what you want by doing or saying anything to get someone to do something? My sister-in-law married a guy who told her he was a millionaire. He wasn't. She married him under those conditions and later lived a regular life. She swears constantly in jest that she was manipulated into marriage. That's not really something we would consider manipulation. My wife and I placed broccoli and carrots in front of our kids. That convinced them to do something that most kids don't do. Is that manipulation? My best friend's wife bakes him his favorite apple pie and gets him his favorite tobacco pipe when she wants to go shopping. Is that manipulation? They all fit the definition, but they are not manipulation, are they? There is something missing in the classical definition of getting what you want out of a person, and that is not just intent. It goes beyond intent, and when you visualize this axis, you should include this in factoring the depth of intention. It has to be a type of malicious intent that is persistent to the point that the other person is not going to put up a defense, because there is no overt sign of force or definable characteristic of the manipulator's actions that suggest manipulation. The reason this happens is because the human mind is very good at identifying individual features, but when you put them all together, it is almost unrecognizable. You get hints and notions of something stirring, but it is hard to determine, and for those who do not have the confidence to rely on their inclinations, the whole picture remains a blur and unrecognizable. This does not mean that humans are stupid, and it certainly does not mean that victims of manipulation are daft. It's just that we do not know what to look for, and so it is unrecognizable to us. We have to be shown a pattern, or at least taught how to find the sting in our hearts, and when we tug on that string, our own subconscious will eventually allow the real picture to come into focus. And that will confirm for us that we are being manipulated. We tend to think of manipulation as something that is obvious, deliberate, and menacing. It can be, but it doesn't have to be, and it rarely has all three of those in its execution. If it did, it would be easily recognizable, and you could put a stop to it instantly. But what we are talking about here is the kind of manipulation that is subtle, possibly inadvertent, and almost always never menacing. But the effects can be disastrous nonetheless. Psychological effects of manipulation. What are the effects of manipulation? Primarily, the effect is one that alters your way of doing something and then changes your frame of reference to fit the alteration. This has psychological consequences. Manipulation is about getting you to do something that you don't want to do or would not have considered and puts you at a disadvantage. If you don't know how you got there, the psychological consequence of being duped can be extensive, especially if the situation lasts over a long period of time. Ironically, the longer you face it and the longer you are subjected to it, there eventually comes a point that your confidence level erodes and the ability to stand up to it gets worse. Eventually, it molds you into subservience and an inability to function normally. This is just one strand of the complicated web of manipulation effects. Chapter 2. Who has the influence? The human mind is so malleable that it can be made to do anything, even things that are against one's own self-interest. This allows us to do a number of things and have a number of things done to us. If you want to understand how the basic mind works, all you need to do is observe a child. Children are easily influenced because their minds are altered in respect to the thing that they are being influenced about. I will give you a simple example. My wife and I conducted an innocuous experiment with our kids when they were young. When our first arrived and was still on milk, he would sit at the table with us during meals, and there would always be a dish of broccoli and carrots at the table, and we made a point to relish it while we ate, and always finished it. No matter what was on the table besides that, meat, potatoes, beans, whatever, there would always be broccoli and carrots. We never tried to feed it to him, we never forced him, and we never introduced it to him. But we scarfed it down at every meal. It was always the first thing we reached for. When he turned 5 months old, we noticed that he would intently watch us as we sat down for the meal, and he would mimic the chewing. We never forced him to switch to solid food. He was always breastfed, and we always let him make his choice. We figured he would tell us when he was ready for solids. His first signal was that he would mimic chewing after watching us at every meal. As a starter, we introduced him to mashed potatoes, and he would flap his gums just as he had mimicked us in the past. He really did love it and was really excited. But something else happened. He started to reach for the broccoli and carrots. I have never known any kid who ate their broccoli after being hounded by concerned parents, much less voluntarily. Fast forward 18 years, and he still loves his broccoli and insists on having it whenever he comes home from college. We thought maybe this was one-off, so we tried it again with our second and our third. All three of them eat their broccoli and carrots, and along the way we added a few other vegetables to the list. This is an important parenting guide for us. We never strike our kids or raise our voice at them. We have conversations, and so it is not always easy to convince a kid to do something. So what we decided to do was teach by example. In doing so, two things happened. We taught them what to do by using the internal desire to mimic, and we learnt as parents there are a scary number of things out there that could influence our kid. Let me explain. The idea of doing this with broccoli and carrots came about when we were talking about TV programs and kids in general. We were talking about how these kids mimicked what they saw on TV and how crazy it was to let that garbage enter a vulnerable kid's mind. It slowly dawned on us that the absorption of an act or behavior was not limited to bad acts or bad habits. They were for all things. So we just decided to change the paradigm to cut out the poor examples and enrich them with the good examples. The results worked out, I am happy to say. The point is, you can influence a kid to do anything. You don't need to scream at them. In fact, screaming at them and forcing them to do things actually doesn't work as well as you would imagine. Instead, you can get them to do things that they may not know to do or may otherwise not want to do. When it comes to your kids, as long as it is in their best interest, you can't call that manipulation. But it is exactly that when the person you are doing it to is an adult, your contemporary, your colleague, your significant other, or whatever the relationship, even if they are strangers. When you intentionally do something to make someone do something that benefits you, materially or psychologically, and that is not directly known to the person, whereby he or she can choose to accept the direction or deny it. The point of this book is to look at manipulation and guide the conversation around the elements of psychological manipulation and emotional manipulation. To be clear, we are not talking so much about a stated threat that leads someone to do something. That is a form of manipulation, but more appropriately, that is an explicit threat. It is more appropriate to call that duress. Emotional manipulation and psychological manipulation are different and cause you to do things that you ordinarily would not do because you fear repercussions by the aggressor. Manipulation is more insidious because it uses your evolved faculties of imagination and fear. It is dangerous, more than any other form of control, because the victim either can't tell they are being manipulated or know it and can't extricate themselves from it. Intangible manipulation has two veins. The first is psychological, the other is emotional. Psychological manipulation is where the victims don't know they are being manipulated, and emotional manipulation is where they may not know it, and even if they do, they can't get out of it. We will start with psychological manipulation and then move on to emotional manipulation because they both have common roots and similar effects, but have distinct differences when it comes to recognizing, preventing, and neutralizing it. Psychological manipulation is what you see in advertisements that make you do things that you don't already want to do, especially when it is against your best interest. You do the bidding and then you have no remorse over it as you are totally on board. The main target, the jugular of the matter, is the person's fear. A good example of psychological manipulation is the recent Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, the vote to leave the European Union. The run-up to the referendum was an amazing study in psychographics and psychological manipulation. Remember we said earlier that influence is the relationship between the influencer and the follower. We automatically give credibility to those who have authority. Advertisements for technological products, like search engines and social networks, try to assign authority to individuals based on popularity. And that is a good place to start when it comes to interpersonal relationships over electronic networks. Determining who has the influence will give you a good picture of the potential for manipulation. The person without the influence is not, by definition, able to manipulate the other. So instead of recognizing manipulation, start with trying to recognize the person with the greater influence in the relationship. Power. In interpersonal relationships, power is the term that is assigned to the person who has the ability to make the other person do what the first person wants, even if and when he doesn't want to. The more the relative dislike, the more the power. Think about it this way as an illustration. If one kid tells another kid to do his homework, something that is really unpleasant and complicated, the second kid is not going to do it because he really doesn't want to. In this case, the first kid has no power over the other kid. Taking that same dynamic, but making it a scenario between a kid and his parent, then when the parent tells the kid to do his homework, the kid does it. That describes the power the parent has over the kid. This is a very innocent and mutually beneficial power. But this is not manipulation because it does not leave the child in a worse-off position after the deed is done. Now look at a third relationship. You just met a stranger and they make you do something that you don't want to do. And once the deed is done, it leaves you in a worse state than before you met, and you received nothing in return. Don't confuse this for emotional manipulation just yet. I am merely trying to exhibit the various shades of power. In this scenario, the person has power over you. Power is a funny thing. It is not absolute. Just because you have power doesn't mean you can wield it over anyone. Power is only exercisable in comparison. That means one must have greater power over the other before it can be used. Remember, power is described or defined as the ability to make someone do something that they ordinarily wouldn't do. We are not quite ready to match this to emotional manipulation, because those with power could emotionally manipulate someone, but those who emotionally manipulate someone are not always powerful. An example of this is if the victim is empathic. An empath is someone who absorbs more emotion than a typical person. If they can sense more than anyone else, then the slightest detection that the other person would like the empath to do something for them will be magnified, and the empath would go about doing it so as not to feel bad about it. This does not mean the other person has the power over the empath. This relates back to the issue of gravity in the manipulation axis. If you recall, gravity describes the person who has the ability to attract manipulators, or the manipulator who has the ability to attract victims. In essence, it is the dynamic between a person who is naturally a victim, a person who is naturally a manipulator, and the combination of the two people who, without the presence of each other, would not be victim or manipulator, but when they meet, they naturally fall into that kind of a relationship. It is important to know which way the gravity moves things. If you can't see the gravitational forces, then you will not be able to recognize your own state in the dynamic. This brings us back to the power. When two natural manipulators come together, there is a clash. When two natural victims come together, there is no pain, but it is still unhealthy. Power is a component of manipulation, but not the only component. Intelligent and sensitive people have power, but they do not use it to manipulate others. The person who does the manipulation is the one who has the greater comparative power and is unable to get what he wants in mutual agreement or through other means, and resorts to underhanded tactics, which usually results in manipulation. To neutralize emotional manipulation, you have to stop caring what the other person says or feels. This balances the power they have over you. Power to compel action using external force is not emotional manipulation. And if you believe that physical harm may result from denial of request by the aggressor, then you have a problem greater than emotional manipulation and beyond the scope of this book. But the power to compel you from within you is emotional manipulation. That gives you two alternatives. First, it can weaken you, or it can make you realize that you have the ultimate power over what goes on inside. Don't let anyone on the outside dictate what goes on inside. Ultimately, only you have the power over your destiny, and you need to make it a habit to remember that. Frame of mind. Not to sound sexist, but women are usually on the receiving end of manipulation. That can be stopped. But to do that, you have to alter the strength of your mind and do it in a way that is more aggressive than it is defensive. Recently, a group of researchers conducted 2 tests to illustrate how powerful, seemingly innocuous events can shape our mind. They went to Harvard University and chose 200 undergraduates and administered a math test. They broke the group up randomly into 2 groups consisting of male and female students. They administered the same test to both groups, except they changed the first question for the 2 groups. For the first group, the first question asked them about their gender, followed by regular math questions. To the second group, the questions were a set of regular math problems. When they scored the exam, the women in the first group, the group that had answered the question about their gender, scored an average of 10 points lower than the guys in that first group, while the women in the second group, who were not asked about their gender, scored the same as the men in the second group. Put a pin in that for a minute. I will come back to that shortly. In another experiment, researchers went into a crowd at a mall, walked up to individuals, and asked them for a favor. The pretense was that they needed help with their cup of coffee while they took their keys out of their pocket. Most strangers obliged, and that was the end of it. They sampled about 200 people, making sure that these people held the cup of coffee, either hot or cold, for at least 20 seconds. Those people were tracked, and a little while later, another researcher would approach them and would request these people to take a random survey in exchange for $20. Most people obliged, as it was a fairly short survey. What they found is relevant to our book here. Those people that were given coffee to hold were separated into two groups. The first group was given a cold cup, while the second was given a warm cup. Those same people, when surveyed, were asked to describe a celebrity that everyone would know. The answers they gave were categorized and fell almost exactly along the lines of the coffee cup's temperature. That is to say, those who held a warm cup of coffee for 20 seconds wrote warmly about the celebrity. Those who held an ice-cold cup wrote a rather cold review instead. There are numerous other tests that prove the thesis that our minds are more malleable than we realize, and that results in the way our minds create our personalities. In the first test, all those who answered the gender question were reminded of their stereotypes, and instantly that altered their ability. The test does not propose that women are less capable than men. Rather, it proves that the stereotype we have of gender differences causes us to behave differently at a subconscious level that can even turn our intellect on and off. It is the same when it comes to being manipulated. It is more prevalent that women are more empathic and the softer side of the equation. Nothing wrong with that, but when you remind someone that that is who they are, they take on stereotypes and then become easier to manipulate. Being told that you are beautiful, sexy, or gorgeous are all ways that lead to a certain form of weakening of your intellect, and that results in the path to manipulation. Well, not at all times, but it can be. Men tend to pay obsequious compliments to women so they can take advantage of the situation. It is not the compliment that breaks them, but the reminder that they are women in conjunction with the compliment. Just like the experiment with the hot cup of coffee and the warm reviews, the human mind that is ignorant of its own weakness can be manipulated without hope of putting up a defense. The very first step in the manipulation process starts with the words a person speaks. You need to be able to recognize it and return the gesture or put a stop to it. Your frame of mind needs to be strengthened before the event. It's like building the walls to a medieval city. You don't erect the walls just when the marauding armies arrive. You build them ahead of time. The other thing that you have to do is alter the stereotypes that you have of your gender and yourself. Once you neutralize that, it's harder for anyone to use that to get you to submit. If you look at the art of enslaving people, even till today, a few slave owners can control hundreds of slaves. Why? Can't the slaves overpower them with numbers? No, because their frame of mind has been manipulated and their mind has submitted. Protect your mind and your thoughts, and you will be able to fend off a large part of the manipulating aggressor. Keeping the fantasy alive. Most manipulative situations are never real. I am not saying that manipulation is not real. It is very real indeed. I am saying that the illusion that the manipulator creates so that the victim will fall in line is based on things that are not real. Manipulators are structurally weak, but have the power on the outside to dictate the terms of the engagement. Think about that for a minute. A person who is not strong would need to resort to manipulative means to make up for what they think they are missing. Why do people cheat in business and politics? Because they don't have the game at the level they need to beat the opponent or the competitor. Why do students cheat on exams? Because they are not up to the mark when it comes to having the level of knowledge they need to make the grade. People do underhanded things when they believe they do not have what it takes to get what they want. Manipulation is the same. Psychographic manipulation is the same when it comes to advertising. Inferior products advertise in unscrupulous ways to be able to convince their audience that their product is better when it really is not. Or, even when their product is good, but they are fighting against another product that is equally good, manipulative advertising is used to rob us of the choices we would have made by messing with our heads. If you can realize for a second that the power of the manipulation doesn't lie within the aggressor, but within you, you may feel like you are to blame for it. But it is not about blame. It is about power. If you take control of the manipulative process and disallow the external hand to come in and move your pieces around, then you will be all the better for it. Power through apparent weakness. In the last section, we looked at the victims of manipulation in terms of gender and why the potential for manipulation exists to a greater degree. But that does not mean in any way that emotional manipulation does not happen in the state of weakness. That is why we specifically looked at the potential gravity a person has when we looked at the manipulation framework. A weaker person can be manipulated to do things they wouldn't normally do because of the other person's ability to manipulate, but sometimes the reverse is true when the person uses their weakness as the tool to manipulate. Because we have a sense of decency and kindness, we would not choose to deny the request of someone who is in apparent difficulty. I traveled to a third world country some time ago and spent some time in one of its bustling cities that had droves of homeless people and a very high poverty rate. There were panhandlers everywhere, and because the competition among panhandlers was so high, they resorted to emotional manipulation. There were many strategies, but the most common was to have crippled children by their side and panhandle for money. The crippled children were almost never their children. They just used them and hardly paid them for it. The visual of seeing an adult carrying a crippled child asking for money is gut-wrenching to those who are not used to such visuals. That is being emotionally manipulative from a point of weakness. They prey on your kindness and common human decency. It is so apparent that even when you get to the point that you know you are being taken advantage of, you still give in. That is the ultimate in emotional manipulation. But there are also other forms of manipulation through weakness, and they can span short games or long games. You will see what this means in Chapter 3. The only way to get through this kind of manipulation is to understand your own perceptions and your own view on things that make you uncomfortable. That means you have to put a full stop at being controlled into helping someone. You should instead make it a habit to help a person on your own time, in your own way. Let me give you an example. When I was approached the first time in this town, I took everything I had in my pocket in the local currency and gave it to the person who was holding this crippled child. But then a friend of mine, who was familiar with the neighborhood, told me what was really going on, and so I learned and decided not to put up to being manipulated. The next time it happened to me, I was approached by a man who had a little blind girl in tow, and he was dragging her along. The difference is that I smelled a strong whiff of alcohol. He came over and asked for money, and said that it was to feed his daughter. If it was indeed his daughter, she indeed looked to be undernourished. Instead of giving him cash, I walked into a convenience store right behind us, and came out with a bag of food and gave it to him. He tried to tell me that he didn't want that, and only wanted cash, which my companion translated for me. I pretended not to understand, and gave him the bag of food anyway. I thought I got around it. But as soon as I walked away, he went straight into the convenience store and traded the food, I left the receipt in the bag, for liquor. I should have known better, but my mind was still clouded by the emotional manipulation that I was being subjected to by the visual of this little girl. So I went back to the convenience store and bought some food, enough for just the little girl, who was sitting by his side, and gave it to her. I told her to eat it while I stood there watching. The moment she had taken a few bites, I left. I don't think the guy could use half-eaten food. The point that I am laboring to make is that emotional manipulation can come in many forms. Weakness is one. It can really pull on your heartstrings, but you have to look at what is real and not give in to the apparent emotional effect that the displayed weakness is supposed to elicit. One way to prevent emotional manipulation is to do things in your own way, in your own time, and not in response to what others try to profit from you. Another element to be aware of is the gravity field between you and any potential manipulator. Manipulation, in any form, is a function of relative strength. It is like the voltage in an electrical circuit where the current flows from a greater power to a lesser one. The difference is called a power potential. Power potential. Power potential is akin to a waterfall. Water will fall from higher ground to lower ground naturally. There are two ways the force of that water can be increased. The first is if you were to increase the height of the fall, then the water will fall with more force. You can think of this part of the analogy as the difference between powers. The second way to increase the power potential is to increase the gravity. If the gravity is significantly higher, then even a short distance in height between the higher ground and the lower ground will yield a powerful difference. The power potential between two people is almost the same way. For the manipulator to emotionally manipulate the victim, there must be a huge power potential. Either the person is significantly more powerful or the victim has a much higher gravity. The person with the greater power potential has the greater influence over the person with the lesser. The best way to detect if manipulation might be an issue is to look at this power potential. You will see this across a large variety of relationships. You see this in cases where people of power have uncommon power over people who work for them. Their emotional manipulation is not just a function of the powerful influencer taking the power, it is also a function of the weaker giving the stronger the power to manipulate. It is the homage of acquiescence. To be able to stave off emotional manipulation requires that you change this power potential. You can do one or both of the things that you see contributing to the differential. The way to do this is to strengthen your mind and to avoid falling prey to the stereotype of your situation. If you are less wealthy than another person, remove wealth from the equation. Do not see yourself in terms of wealth. If you see the other person to be more charming, then either you advance your charm or you extricate charm from the equation. If you are dominated by wit, then turn silent. No level of wit in the world can penetrate the shield of silence. If all else fails, walk away. The power potential is at play in all relationships, from father and son to husband and wife, best friends, between lovers, and among strangers in a bar. You just have to figure out which arena it is in with a particular person and then apply the appropriate antidote. Once you can recognize the power potential and apply the antidote, you are halfway out of manipulation's grip. Chapter 3. How to tell if you're being manipulated. Manipulation is about survival. The one who is manipulated fears something in the situation that is a threat to his or her survival. And the person who is doing the manipulation is doing so because he or she thinks that it is advancing their survival. It really boils down to that. Think long and hard about it, and you will find that it indeed comes down to survival. Animals fight for territory because of survival. Humans fight for politics because of survival. But that perspective of survival is not always true, because what they perceive and what really is never the same. Your interest is in survival, but being the subject of manipulation is not going to advance the elements of survival. It will eventually diminish it in the long term. Let's look at a hypothetical scenario, just to drive the point. If you know the relationship is manipulative, then you should also know that the manipulator has all the power. But you're okay with that, because you get something in return, the suppression of your greater fears, perhaps the fear of being alone, or the fear of confrontation, or something more. You make the conscious decision that the manipulation is acceptable because the consideration you receive from that manipulation is acceptable, or at least you grow into it. But what happens if one day that person does the exact thing you are afraid of, and let's say, leaves you? Now what has happened is that you are crushed, robbed of your strength, and alone. Nothing is worth being manipulated over. But you can't fight the person who is manipulating you. You have only two ways to handle this. You either let the person know that you are feeling manipulated, or you get out from under the situation. Easier said than done, I know. The thing that you need to learn, above all else, is the art of knowing when you are being manipulated. With respect to time, there are two kinds of manipulation strategies that you need to be aware of. There is the one-off manipulation that someone does to make sure they get something they want. The second one is the long horizon perpetual manipulation, where you slowly but surely capitulate in many different areas. We will look at both in turn to show you how to recognize the patterns to understand if you are being manipulated. Short game. The short game refers to one-off manipulation strategies, and they are basically somebody wanting something that you otherwise would not give. There is a lot of this going on, and you could look at this from the perspective of the aggressor or the perspective of the victim. I am going to look exclusively at the perspective of the victim, and especially the kind of victim that keeps getting manipulated by more than one person and many times in their life. You can think of the victim as a pushover or a person who is just a glutton for punishment. I am not talking about people who lose their money to scammers or people who get cheated by traveling salesmen. I am talking about the kind of person that is easy to manipulate because they just want to be accepted or they just want to be liked. The first thing that you have to recognize in the art of manipulation is not to look at the guy a mile away, but to look at yourself in the mirror. There are people who are going to immediately jump and say that it is in bad taste to point the finger at the victim. But we are not here to point the finger at the victim. We are here to protect the victim. You need to stop yourself from playing the victim and start learning how to stand up for yourself. Manipulators are everywhere. You can't change all of them or punish all of them. You can only protect yourself. Look at it this way. Imagine if you were the king of a country, and there are 20 other countries around you, and all of them have nuclear weapons. Which is easier? Are you going to convince them to dismantle their missiles? Or are you going to get your own missiles? Nuclear proliferation issues aside, you get the point. 10 steps to survive the short game. The only true way to survive and thrive in this world is to bolster yourself and keep yourself on the cutting edge of self-improvement. Now we come to the first thing that you have to do to get yourself fortified so that others don't mark you as a target and you don't succumb to their methods. Your disposition should be that you are affable to everyone, but you are no one's fool, and as such, you should always look at the possibility that any request out of the ordinary, an act out of the norm, or any gesture beyond the boundaries is a warning sign that you should just rebuff the contact. That's your first act. Your second act is to never concede defeat. A person who misses a step and then festers over it is a person who is a target for manipulation. Here is an example. Let's say someone manipulates you into lending them money. They use all kinds of emotional tactics and you give in. Sometime later, this person and your money vanish. The thing you shouldn't do is go on about how you got duped. You should turn it around and stand up and say you did it knowing that the person was going to do this and that the money was not a big deal. But internally, you should learn how you fell for the emotional manipulation and not let that happen again. There are 2 reasons for this. The more you beat yourself up externally, the more you set yourself up to be a target, and the more you damage yourself psychologically. You have to turn each assault into your advantage, and learning is the best advantage. Never advertise that you have been victimized. The third is that you can learn from mistakes before they become a pattern. You can see people a mile away that are going to take advantage of your state. Have you ever heard the thing about how guys look for one-night stands with girls who are vulnerable because they just broke up? That's emotionally manipulative. Have you ever seen women who manipulate men into doing what they don't want to do by suggesting suicide? That's manipulative. These may not be anything you are faced with or things that you do, and that's not the point. But you see the use of heartstrings in making someone else do something that they don't want to do, before the event and during the event. Psychological manipulation is a little different. That's when you alter another person's way of thinking into doing something even if they didn't want to do it before they heard the pitch. They were more than willing to do it and didn't feel like they were forced to do it. Look at the difference. It's subtle and it's almost imperceptible. It is one you can't really define, but you know it's there. That's why emotional manipulation is so egregious, because it is so insidious. The next thing that you need to do to detect if there is emotional manipulation is to trust your instincts. It is safe to say that you should never allow anyone into your emotional side until you find out that they have passed all the criteria that you have put in place. It's like letting someone into your home. If you let someone in and they take your stuff, you have no one to blame but yourself. At least that is a good way to look at it. Of course, there are those who would say that most people don't do that, and you should not keep yourself castled within your own heart. But that is not the case. That only holds for the person who is not the kind that others see as someone that could be manipulated. If you find that more than one person comes along and manipulates you for one thing or another, then you need to pull up the drawbridge, drop the gates, and lock up the castle. Unless that person has the secret handshake and password, they don't get to pass. The fourth thing that you should do is always fend for yourself and never allow someone to get away with something because you need their friendship or you need someone to like you. You do not need anyone to like you, and you certainly do not need to purchase that affection. Your fifth step is to listen and remember. Most manipulators can be found out very easily if you take the effort to listen to everything they have to say and remember it, because in time it won't make sense. Manipulation is not righteous, and thus the facts will never hold up in daylight. When a person constantly lies or lies in key areas, especially if their lies are close to the truth, then you need to be very careful. This is most prominent with the long game players, which we will look at in the next section. But for the short game, manipulators lie close to the truth and are never sincere. If you take the effort to listen and remember, you will be able to detect their kind. You don't have to call them out on the lies or deceit. You just need to move away as quickly as you can. This is so you do not get into an untenable situation or a trap. The sixth thing you should watch out for is a trap. Emotional manipulators are looking for the opportunity to spring a trap on you, and it is an emotional trap. They want to get you emotionally indebted to them, or they want you to owe them, so they may go out of the way to offer you a favor and then manipulate your sense of gratitude in order to extract what they want. To be clear, in life, there are lots of quid pro quo situations, but emotional manipulation is not that. It is about trapping you, then extracting what they want by reminding you that you owe them, or by triggering your sense of decency or guilt. The seventh thing to watch out for and overcome is the pity manipulator. They are looking to lean on your sense of empathy. You will notice that most people who are manipulated, like the ones in Chapter 1 where we talked about gravity, those who are empathic or have sensitive constitutions are easily manipulated because they thrive on your pity, and they can extract whatever they want because they can spark the sense of pity in you, and you will do what they want even though you don't want to, because the pain of not complying is too much. This is why you have to block any outward emotion of what affects you and what pulls you down. The eighth step is recognizing the pattern of manipulators. They always want something for nothing, or they want something that is inequitable, meaning that you give up significantly more than they do emotionally. If the relationship is new and they want a huge favor and they use guilt, pity, or gratitude to extract it from you, then, on principle, you should decline. Better to feel guilty in the short run than to be emotionally manipulated. The ninth one is the manipulation by a friend who you've known for some time. Familiarity sometimes does breed contempt, and sometimes when they want something, they forget the bedrock friendship, and they manipulate you based on the loss of friendship if you don't come through for them. This is in all our DNAs. Kids do that to other kids. Often, they grow up using their friendship as a threat and saying they won't be your friend if you don't do something for them. Even if you were the kind to capitulate back then, don't do it now. Even if you understand their position, never capitulate. Finally, you can identify the short game manipulator by the shift in the nature of his or her approach. An emotionally manipulative gesture starts with a break in routine behavior, if this person is known to you. You will also have noticed that they have manipulated others in front of you, and they do it without realizing that they are manipulating. Most manipulators are not conscious of their own actions. They just want something for nothing and are sociopathic in the way they go about it. If you see someone manipulate others, watch them carefully and keep your drawbridge up when they are around. Many of the short game strategies can happen in the long game as well, as we will soon see. Long game. Although we refer to this as the long game, I can assure you there is nothing fun about this. The long game is about the manipulation that happens over years, and it is one that is as corrosive as it is insidious. When the game is said and done, the victim is left sapped of their confidence and their state of mind. Much of the rest of this book is dedicated to the skills and strategies to look within yourself to overcome the power of the long game and the typical manipulator. The long game occurs over years and could be one that happens in a marriage, in a long-term relationship, between parents and children, between siblings, or even between classmates. It is dangerous because the victim is more emotionally vested than the short game. It is also worse than the short game because it could either mean the victim is stuck and in fear, or it could mean that the manipulation will end in a very bad state. In the first scenario, the victim could be manipulated and know it, but the level of fear is so significant that he or she cannot extricate themselves from it. The second one is that the victim has become so dependent on the manipulator that it is easier to be manipulated than it is to leave. What's worse is a variation of this scenario, where the relationship has become codependent and the manipulator still wields power over the victim. In this case, the stress can increase because the manipulator needs to extract more in return for less. 10 ways to overcome the long game. The first lesson of avoiding the long game is to not let the short game evolve into a long one. Make sure you do not entertain any hesitancy in walking away from a short game and make sure that it doesn't evolve into a long one. Sometimes, if manipulators find that they can get more out of easy prey, they extend their horizon. The second lesson is to make sure you have set your own rules. Make sure to keep your boundaries and respect others' boundaries as well. If you are in a situation where boundaries are being violated, you need to make it clear. Sometimes boundaries are breached unintentionally, and this can then become a habit, and then what happens is that the victim becomes an accidental victim, and the manipulator becomes an accidental manipulator. The best thing to do is to air it out as soon as you feel something is not comfortable. The third lesson is to never allow penetration of those boundaries until you are good and ready. Breaching boundaries is a major issue in long-term relationships. If you are in a relationship where there are no boundaries, then you need to create some where it matters most. The fourth is the moving of these boundaries. Do not compromise your boundaries in a way that you move them just because they were breached. You have to hold on to these boundaries no matter how close you are to this person. It is almost a pipe dream to think that a person should just meld their minds into yours and the two become one. That does not happen often, and it does not happen when one party is weaker than the other. Look at it this way. Would you want to meld your mind to someone weaker than you? And manipulators always see their victims as weak. They have no intention of becoming one with you. Their only intention is to make use of you to the furthest extent that you allow them to. A real romance, a real friendship, or real relationship is based on having respect for each other and living in mutually beneficial states, not dependent ones. The fifth is being in a one-way relationship, where you are clinging on to something that is not real or something that you want and they are out to exploit that. In everything that you do, if you don't want to be a victim, you need to develop strength. There are loads of people out there who get manipulated for the simple reason that they do not want to be alone. And so, rather than face the prospect of solitary living, they allow themselves to be manipulated just so they have somebody around them. The sixth thing you need to be cognizant of in order to avoid or extricate yourself from a manipulative situation is the voice of your heart. One of the things that most people forget is that they actually know what is going on. They just choose to bury their head in the sand, or they choose to let the situation take care of itself. There is some merit to that strategy, but it doesn't come from acquiescence. It comes from driving the solution. You do not need to be confrontational to neutralize the emotional manipulation. You have to strengthen your mental state and then stand your ground. The seventh thing that you need to look at is the external factors that are causing hesitance in departure or repair. First of all, not every situation warrants departure, breakup, or another form of permanent disassociation. In some cases, highlighting the problem can have a considerable impact. But you need to look at all the factors that are tripping you up. For instance, mothers with kids may find that breaking up will cause a problem for the kids. That's just an example to show the kinds of external issues that may be weighing you down. You need to get familiar with what those issues are so you can isolate the kinds of reasons that are preventing the hard conversations and the possible break. The eighth issue you need to look at to work your way toward overcoming this situation is to keep track of each issue that is causing you discomfort. Short of outright fear, you need to look at each emotional response to the situation. You need to take the time to look at this in a way that is methodical, so that you do not let a simple issue blow up into a critical one. Your job here is to find a solution, and not to make things worse. The ninth thing that you need to do is find the emotional leverage that is being used and neutralize it as quickly as possible. Emotional manipulation is about manipulating you from the inside, and that is usually connected to something. When the manipulator finds the thing that you yield to, they have their hook to get under your skin. You need to isolate and understand the emotional trigger and neutralize that trigger before the manipulator knows what is going on. That may actually be good for both of you. Finally, you need to seek emotional support from a neutral party that is not going to take your side, but is also not going to feed the anxiety. In a long-term manipulative situation, it may be tough to see things on your own, but a third party may be able to be your eyes and ears. I am very against the involvement of third parties in a two-party relationship because the complex dynamics are never easily explained or understood. But in the case of emotional manipulation, it can be hard to see the forest for the trees, or it may be difficult to see past the baggage. The person that you choose to help you must not be emotionally vested, or must not be able to sway the situation any further than it already is. In total, there are 20 ways of looking at the possible ways someone could be manipulating you. There are more, but these are synthesized in such a way that you can use them to develop a sense of what is going on, instead of giving you an exhaustive checklist that would completely be overwhelming and possibly cause you to derive the wrong conclusions for a situation that is unique to you. Your first act should be to look at the appropriate issue, long or short term. The second would be to look at your list and then think about the items in it and see how they apply to you, if at all. The third is to look at this list and be positive about yourself. You are not a failure for being manipulated emotionally. It is part of all of us to have fears and to have anxiety. You will see that the next chapter is dedicated to this topic, and you will start to understand how your mind works and what happens when you are faced with something like this. The real incredible thing that you can do is not to give up, but to strengthen your own psyche and then evaluate what you want to do from there. Unless the situation is life-threatening, you should not try to come to a conclusion harshly or in haste. If you feel like you are in mortal danger, then you need to be smart about it and seek professional help. The role of the manipulator's intent. Most people want to know how to read the intent of the would-be manipulator, and for that I say there is no need to do so, because there is a more effective way, and that is to look within yourself and see the power potential between the two individuals. Humankind is fairly opportunistic in its ways, and that can be said for all species of life on this planet. Even water is opportunistic in the way it fills holes and crevices. It doesn't leave any spot untouched. The role of the manipulator's intent is then wholly irrelevant because regardless of whether they intend to manipulate you or they do it unbeknownst to themselves, the effect is the same. In fact, those who premeditate it may be easier to talk to than those who do it on autopilot. That's because they are so deep into it that they don't even know they are doing it. And you can't talk to someone about something they don't even think exists. But if the person's intent becomes clear because you have seen them manipulate others, then you don't even need to think twice before you sever the relationship. Never start anything with a person you know is manipulative. The benefit is never worth the cost in the relationship, and it will tire you out. The more they launch assaults, the more you are forced to defend yourself. You have no choice in the matter. You should never let a manipulator into your mind, and so you should strengthen your defenses. That takes energy and time. Just fending them off can be a full-time job, so you don't even want to get into that position. Move on. Manipulators are not worth it. Every relationship needs to be in balance. There should always be give and take, and it should always be a zero-sum game for the individuals, but a net gain for the couple. Let me explain. A balanced relationship is one that sees equitable contribution from both sides, where Party A gives the same as Party B. There is no net gain. But as a whole, when you put it together, Group AB, consisting of Party A and B, is no greater than the sum of the parts. That is a normal relationship. It is mutually respectful and mutually beneficial. But in a manipulative relationship, this is not limited to couples, it can be any relationship. One party contributes more and loses more while getting nothing in return, and the sum of the two is less than the parts. This is not only a manipulative situation, and one that results in a net loss, but one that is bordering on psychologically abusive. That is the reason that emotionally manipulative relationships should never be encouraged, pursued, continued, or tolerated. They should be terminated without mercy and without regret. If a person allows you to manipulate them, then you should look at getting out of that relationship. And if a person is manipulating you, then you should get out of that relationship as well. No good will come from it, and the tools to getting out are simple. Recognize it and outwit it by strengthening your own psyche. One thing that you should know, however, is that the core of the manipulator's intent consists of instilling fear in their victims. They do this with full knowledge of their intention, or they do it unintentionally. If you can understand your fears, then you can overcome any form of manipulation. That is the subject in the next chapter. Chapter 4. The Psychology of Fear in Manipulation. We are born with fear in us. It is a chemical, genetic, and physiological phenomenon that helps keep us alive. Remember that one of the purposes we possess inherently is survival. Fear promotes survival by changing our physiological state from one of rest to one of high alert. There is fear involved in everything we do. Some fears we feel intensely, others mildly, and some even result in no perceptible response. Fear is a deep subject, and it is at the heart of almost everything we do. No matter how confident we are or how strong, fear is pervasive and ever present. The only difference between one situation and the next is the degree of fear. Before we get further into it, it will be best if we take a serious look at the components of fear and the severity of the various degrees of fear, so that we can identify them, their triggers, the way we respond to them, and, if we can find their profiles and identify them, we can then pinpoint the events that lead toward manipulation. Why? Because fear is the tool that keeps victims paralyzed. This paralysis first removes resistance to manipulation, and then goes on to alter the mind in a way that affects the way victims see themselves. This will become clear as we deconstruct the essence of fear. Fundamentals of fear. Fear describes certain emotional, psychological, and physiological states. We sometimes use the term fear when we intend to describe anxiety, phobia, or even being scared. However, to be accurate, fear is more the physiological response to the comprehensive input of the various faculties within the brain when it is presented with stimulus happening externally or internally, perceived or real, that would result in a certain hazard. In simpler terms, here's what we need to look out for. Comprehensive input, cerebral faculties, perceived or real stimulus, and hazard. Comprehensive input. When professionals talk about comprehensive input, they are trying to convey that the mind is more than a single entity. Instead, it is made up of a countless number of physical and functional areas. These areas are not something that can be individually identified and extricated easily. It's not like a hard drive and a processor in a computer, where you can look under the hood and it's all neatly arranged. Comprehensive input is built over the experience of a lifetime and from genetic inheritance. Take, for instance, a child who has never been burnt by a flame before. No matter how much you explain the pain of being singed, the child is not going to fully understand it until he or she experiences it themselves. The experience is complex. There are different kinds of pain, different periods of consequence, and there is a change in the perception of fire, which until then has been good from a distance. The input is complex and comprehensive. The combined response to this, or any stimuli, involves various parts of our mind, that is, memory of pleasure and pain, experiences of detriment, ability to visualize consequences, even imagination, all come into play. It is the compilation of these responses that act as a cascade heading toward our fear center. When the threshold is overwhelmed, the symptoms of fear kick in. Anxiety is intimately related to fear and is part of the whole manipulation process. You will have an underground tremor feeling, as in it's there but barely perceptible. Your anxiety is a flag that tells you that something is not right and that something beneath the surface is happening, but you just can't detect the epicenter of the problem. Most victims of manipulation get this after a while, but they brush it off and the symptoms manifest in physical issues: migraine, anxiety, breakouts, early onset of menopause, loss of sexual appetite, and so on. This is a little different than the symptoms of fear, which are significantly more proactive and urgent in the response that manifests. The onset of anger, hatred, and the energy to run or the urge to fight are more attuned to a person who is already aware of manipulation but has no power to stop it. Cerebral faculties. Your brain is just tissue supplied with oxygen and nutrients. It has a specific function, just like your heart, kidneys, or lungs. But beware of thinking that the brain and the mind are the same. They are not. The brain is a physical object and thereby tangible, whereas the mind is a concept and therefore intangible. The mind requires a functioning brain to perform. The brain does not need a functioning mind to survive. Your physical brain is made up of 4 distinguishable areas: the brain stem, the limbic system, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. Research has proven the evolution of the brain, and we know that it started with the brain stem. That's the part that sits at the base of your skull and is attached to the spine and was the first to form. Subsequently, the limbic system came about, and this was over the course of thousands of generations. The limbic system sits on top of the brainstem and is tasked with homeostasis, the responsibility to maintain the body in balance. Take perspiration, for instance. It is a homeostatic function designed to cool the body when it exceeds normal operating temperatures. It turns out that our fear center is also located here, and that is why many of the homeostatic functions tend to activate when we experience fear: sweating, heavy breathing, dilated pupils, etc. Fear evolved at the time as a defense mechanism for all species. Even trees have it, but it is controlled differently. All animals and creatures have fear centers, and they are almost always located in the same approximate area relative to the strata of the brain. You need fear to survive. It gives you the boost of strength, like nitrous oxide does to a race car. Without it, you would not be able to ramp up the needed strength to fight or to flee. Fear and anxiety are good things when kept in control and understood. If you are the subject of manipulation, anxiety is the warning sign. Fear is the call to action. From modern neuroscience, we know beyond any doubt that the fear center has influence and control over other areas of the brain. It can instruct the brainstem to control involuntary acts. It can prepare the body for enhanced performance, or it can just cut off all movement, like when a child freezes in fear, or a deer in headlights. As such, we realize that fear can cause one of 3 possible outcomes: fight, flight, or freeze. Freezing is a very important aspect of self-preservation. It may not be totally useful in modern contexts for the human species, but if you think about the predator-prey dynamic, you will see that many predators have eyesight that rely on contrast and movement. So if the potential prey is still, it doesn't get noticed. That is the reason for naturally freezing, and we still have that today. Remember, we may have developed different physical forms from our ancestors, but the brain that we possess is the result of evolution across a longer period of time. This is the reason we freeze when faced with a situation that raises fear in us. Freezing also applies to us when we are aware of manipulation. The freeze here is one that straddles indecision. One dimension we are uncertain of is our own feelings of fear. The second is that we do not want to rock the cart, because a known inequity is better than an unknown consequence. The third is we languish while we allow more evidence to pile up or the situation to change. Manipulation can change for the better, but it can also get worse. Until you have more information where it is going, your situation is precarious. Back to the brain. As the brain evolved, more sophistication built on top of the primal brain. Take, for instance, the appreciation of art. The taste, ability to interpret, and the refined aspects of subtle variances in art and taste reside in the neocortex, the latest addition to the brain. It is the neocortex that gives us the sophistication that those with less developed brains do not have. But the primal and the contemporary versions of your brain are connected. That connection results in more sophisticated versions of fear and anxiety. For this reason, anxiety and fear can impair our ability to analyze and our judgment. The centers to analyze and adjudicate are actually fine, but they get blocked by the fear center. The fear and the resolution of that fear become the highlight. Needless worry, followed by the resolution of that worry, form a habit of intoxicating pleasure. That pleasure creates a habit so much so that the body starts to deal in the habit of worry and resolution, rather than dealing with the underlying problem. Fear also has control of the brain's punishment and reward mechanisms, so that fear creates a habit to obey the limbic system rather than to override it. This has to do with habits, and what you will find is that over time, anxieties get worse because the limbic system rewards us to behave that way. It's like having ice cream when we know we shouldn't. Be aware that the part of you that is reading and assimilating the information in this book is part of the neocortex, and because the old and the new parts of the brain are hardwired, being overwhelmed by the neocortex can trigger the fear centers of the brain. Ever feel that you are afraid when you are overwhelmed? On the other hand, this nature of being hardwired on top of each other also has a reverse effect. When you get overwhelmed in other areas of the neocortex, it tends to trigger your limbic system, and you start to activate the fear responses of your primal brain. The state of modern man is not one where he fears a predator beast on a daily basis, but rather he has other elements of his life that tend to overwhelm him, and tend to threaten other centers of his existence, and present hazards that activate the fear center of the brain. The reverse is also true. Because of this hardwired state, being overwhelmed in other areas of the neocortex seems to activate the fear centers of the limbic system. So modern man does not have the fear centers activated just when a wolf attacks. He also triggers symptoms of fear when other areas of his life threaten a negative consequence. You will see this as the elements of fear are listed later in the book. Manipulators are good at using these natural fears when getting control of their victims. They place them in untenable positions and then extract their benefit, while making the victim feel that that is the best way forward. When we refer to cerebral faculties, we are not talking about the structural sections of the brain as much as we are referring to the functional aspects of the mind. Mental faculties are not something totally physical like the brain. They are power centers of the brain that result from the combination of evolution, experience, teaching, and conditioning. One of our most powerful centers is the ability to reason and rationalize. This is opposed to our ancient faculty of fear. Perceived or real stimulus. If you recall, the next factor in the clinical definition of fear is stimuli, real or perceived. Stimuli, whether real or perceived, refers to anything that automatically has an impact and evokes a response, whether it is physically acted out or just imperceptibly felt. A joke is a kind of stimuli that causes laughter. A child's nightmare, although wholly imagined, is a stimulus that triggers a real sense of fear. Fear is oblivious to whether the stimuli are real or imagined. If you sit down long enough and imagine the most fearful thing, you will experience fear. When relevant stimuli is presented, the fear center of the brain is activated and initially puts the fight or flight responses on standby. The body receives a rush of adrenaline, pores open, pupils dilate, and blood pressure increases, all things you need to fight or flee the scene. In manipulation, the offensive act does not rise to the level of imminent danger, and so fear is not triggered in the same way, but more in a way that leaves you incapacitated from indecision, as you are left guessing. The indecision and the hint of something wrong affect the neocortex and overwhelm it, and that triggers the fear center. But there is one problem with this logic thus far. What has all this got to do with manipulation? Manipulation is about the use of fear and indecision that allows the aggressor to reach within the victim and use that fear to his advantage. The palette of fear stretches over 5 distinct elements. When you understand this, you will be able to better understand your response to manipulation. These elements of fear are called hazards. Hazards. These elements need some differentiation from stimuli. There are 5 main hazards that sit at the core of fear. They stay regardless of upbringing, social values, or culture. In short, they are common to every human being. Existential. The first main hazard is any form of existential threat. Our minds are designed to protect our lives and existence so that we can propagate our species. Remember that is the purpose of life. When you hear about the science of evolution, natural selection, food chain, and survival of the fittest, this is nature's way to counterbalance life on Earth. If gazelles in the savannah had no fear, then fight or flight wouldn't kick in when a lion pursues, and they would be devoured without a chase or a fight. Eventually, all the gazelles would be dead, and because of a lack of prey, the lions would be dead too. This logic is simplistic, but it's valid nonetheless. Fear keeps life alive and in balance. The basis of fear here is self-preservation, which in turn is responsible for the longevity of the species and, by extension, biodiversity. But used incorrectly, fear can be misunderstood and manipulated to affect us. This is what we have to get a grip on. Mutilation. The second hazard is the possibility of mutilation. Mutilation or loss of limb ranks high in the terms of ability to evoke fear. Mutilation also covers things like being mauled by a bear, bitten by a dog, or even stung by a bee. Freedom. The third is the loss of freedom. The pain of this loss is long-lasting, and those with even the slightest imagination find the pain unbearable, and thus the fear is even greater. Loss of freedom is not just the act of being kidnapped or imprisoned. It even includes the fear of losing the ability to walk. An acute sense of claustrophobia, as an example, arises from this. It can even be the loss of freedom due to financial wherewithal. It is possible to be manipulated into things, but accepting them because the lifestyle is good. Social abandonment. The fourth is the hazard of social abandonment. We are social animals and require the collaboration and companionship of society to exist. Social abandonment is a precursor to extinction, and it is a powerful fear factor. Separation anxiety reflects such a situation or event. Getting used to an aggressor can be a cause for manipulation when the victim thinks they will lose the ability to see the manipulator again. Ego. The final and most potent hazard that ignites fear is the death of the ego. This is more so in humans because of the existence of the ego in the human species as opposed to less evolved animals. However, the ego is deeply ingrained in humans and it is complex. It manifests in everyone differently. Fear of the death of ego is unfathomable to the average mind. Every other fear, phobia, and anxiety that you can think of is a derivation of one or a combination of these 5 hazards. The intensity can also vary, and it can sometimes be real or perceived. Fear and manipulation. Fear arises because of manipulation, and fear can give rise to manipulation. The human condition is built on a hierarchy. We see this in insects and animals. Have you ever seen a pack of wolves devour their prey? The alpha male is the first to eat, and once he is done, the rest start to attack the carcass in a pre-established pecking order. The weakest one is the last one to eat. This is the wolf that is the least aggressive and most afraid, and because of this comparative level of fear and strength, the weaker one is dominated. It is the path of all things that live. Fear exhibited by an individual is not only the cause of manipulation, it is also the reason for manipulation. And that is the reason that a person who is being manipulated needs to come to the truth on their own, and the person who is looking in from the outside needs to be very delicate with how they handle it and assign blame. The last thing you want to do is place the blame on the aggressor. In some situations, that would actually weaken the victim even more. As you go through this book and you bring to mind the other areas of manipulation we have talked about, remember also that fear is founded on the 5 things we referred to as hazards: existence, mutilation, freedom, society, and ego. On top of that, add the framework of intent, relationship, and gravity, and you will see that the manipulation of a person is best handled by the participants in the following order. 1. Victim. 2. Aggressor and victim. 3. Aggressor. The highest priority in solving a manipulative situation is to be able to recognize yourself as a victim and empower your mind and spirit to break its grip. This means it is the victim that needs to stand up to it, understand their own position and role, and take back the power the aggressor has over them. The simplest way to look at it is to look at the list above. The person who is the most responsible and the person who is the most responsible for your happiness is you. The person most responsible for your safety is you, and you have all you need to bring that to fruition. The only thing that is stopping you is your mindset, and that has become a habit. You need to reverse that habit, and you need to be able to snatch the power back for yourself. We look at how to get out of manipulation in the next chapter. Chapter 5. Beliefs, Habits, and Overcoming Manipulation. The bricks and mortar in the analogy, which are built on the foundation, are the beliefs that you come to learn, experience, and figure out. They are learned, one brick at a time, from the things you observe growing up. It's the things you hear your parents and other influential people say. It's the books you read and the movies you watch. All these form an intricate web of beliefs that thicken over time. Beliefs. Beliefs are not easily disposed of, but when they are altered, they change a wide array of things in one's life. Like breaking down a wall and making an extension. You can't demolish that wall with everyday activity. You have got to get a sledgehammer and use muscle to bring it down. On top of the bricks and mortar in the analogy comes plaster. In the psyche, this refers to thoughts. Thoughts tend to reflect the state of the brick and mortar underneath. If the brick is laid evenly, the plaster goes on evenly, masking minor variations, but exposing major ones. Thoughts are what circulate in the conscious realm in your head. It's what you hear. It is the voice of your beliefs, presented in terms your conscious mind comprehends. Most likely, it manifests in your primary language, and it uses the vocabulary you most commonly engage in. If you use positive imagery, positive language, you can be fairly certain that your thoughts will also be positive. If you are prone to exaggeration, your language will also be bombastic. On top of the plaster comes paint, the building's equivalent of the psyche's facade. This is the part that gives rise to duality, sometimes even forms the beginning of split personality, although there is more to that. The facade is where we say things we don't really mean. Times when we say good morning, even when we feel like it's a lousy day, or when we compliment something unsightly. The facade alters with the outside environment and is designed to bridge a person with the environment. The subconscious of the human psyche, continuing with the house analogy, is everything from the foundation to the plaster, excluding the paint and the voice in your head. You can't directly see, hear, feel, or touch the subconscious. But without it, your persona and your psyche would not exist efficiently. We hear the term subconscious mind every time we pick up material related to psychology. Sometimes it's really elusive to pin down the actual meaning, but trying to explain the world of the subconscious is a topic of an entirely separate book or volume of books. For our purposes, in getting to the bottom of fear, it will suffice to say that the subconscious mind is the crucial behind-the-scenes process that has a significant impact on our attitudes, moods, behaviors, personality, choices, and such. The subconscious is a valuable part of our existence. You can't just observe it with your senses. If you want to know what your subconscious is doing, you have to go about it differently. You have to partake in something called reflection, specifically introspective reflection. Reflection is where we look for clues into our subconscious. We will look at this later in the book. As we move from the subconscious to the surface, we communicate with other living organisms, including other humans, animals, and plants. Our communication with them is a function of what we believe inside, expressed by thoughts. Our communication takes the form of words in any language, and when those words are repeated enough times, they cause a feedback loop in our own psyche, whereby our actions will soon be influenced by our own words. This is one of the reasons positive reinforcement works so well, and so does negative reinforcement. Habits. Habits are neither good nor bad. They are just the mind's way to automate and shift some of the processing burden away from the conscious mind. Remember, the conscious mind is rather limited in capacity. The conscious mind is extremely capable of processing and handling one thing at a time. Habits have three parts to them: a trigger, an act, and a reward. Imagine a trigger as an event where someone gives you something. You respond with something your parents taught you to do, which is to say, thank you, the act. This results in you feeling good and seeing the appreciation in the presenter's eyes. That's your reward. After the first, second, and third time, the act of saying thank you becomes a habit. Fear can become a habit as well. So can anxiety. So can phobias. So can crying. Once they become a habit, you have one additional area of your mind that you have to deal with to change. Be careful of what you do repeatedly, because it gets worse if it becomes a habit. If you act in a certain way, it will eventually become a habit. Once something becomes a habit, and it continues, it becomes part of who you are. It pervades the realm of just being an action and now becomes part of your value system. When a habit is repeated enough times, it penetrates to the foundation and becomes part of your ego. This becomes harder to change, but not impossible. In many instances, failure is a habit. When habits combine with fear and the common goal is failure, there is no way your conscious mind will ever overcome it. It will trip you up at every step. The reason it becomes harder is because once something gets past your conscious thought and down to your foundation, it becomes subconscious, and you can't pinpoint it without the help of a psychiatrist or by deep introspection and reflection. That is what we are going to teach you to do here. You are very much in control of your destiny. If you think it's fear that's tripping you up, then get ready to break those shackles. Because if you don't, then those skewed, fear-tainted values and actions will hijack your destiny. Reflection. To tackle fear, habits, and manipulation, your first move is to understand their source in you, then understand their implications, followed by what aspects, if any, you need to alter to arrive at your desired outcome. There is only one way to do this: reflection. Let's give the idea of reflection a little light. To reflect on something is to think deeply about it. When you think deeply, it means you need to think past what is superficial and look deeper. Since you can't detect the processes of your subconscious mind, you need to deduce its motivation and its design from the thoughts and actions that manifest from it. To be introspective means to look at something inside. When we put the parts together, what reflection means is to take a hard look at the thoughts that go through your mind, the actions that you commit, and the resulting forces that act on your life. Detecting your fear profile is best approached from reflection, because it gets you to look hard at the consequences of your actions and your thoughts. But you can't just change your thoughts overnight, and even if you tried forcing yourself to change the way you think, it wouldn't work, at least not for long. To really change your destiny, you have to change your actions as well. To do that, you need to change your actions and your patterns. Of course, you could superficially change your words by consciously drafting and editing what you say on the fly. But that would be insincere. Insincerity places a heavier burden on you and restricts your chances of success. But the problem with going anywhere deeper than your thoughts, as mentioned earlier, is that the language and mode of communication changes. Your subconscious does not speak your same language. In fact, your subconscious communicates with you in a binary language, and it's hard to decipher when you merely glance at it. To make any sense of it requires deep reflection. How to conduct reflection. Reflection should be conducted once a day, every day at a specific time of day, so as to create a habit. It is preferable to do so before you sleep at night, but more importantly, it should be done in solitude without any distractions. Begin by relaxing and looking back at the events of your day and the events that involved an aggressor. Since you already know the 5 hazards, try to draw a straight line from the permission you gave to be manipulated to one or more of the hazards. Use your imagination. Ask hard questions. Take responsibility for the catastrophe, but do it without feeling guilt or fault. Don't be disappointed if you do not seem to make any progress the first few times. Keep at it. Reflection will eventually start to pay off as you begin to instinctively see the correlation of events of manipulation and things that trigger your subconscious fears. When you begin to make headway, it will be in the form of being able to identify which hazards correspond to which fears. What you will eventually see is that there is a pattern. Most people, by the time they hit 30, have established their subconscious fear patterns. Face your fears. Once you get into the routine of reflection, you will find that thoughts will pop into your head at other times of the day. These are just the revelations of your inner mind. Take note of them. As you begin to recognize your hazards and their corresponding fears, it is time for you to look at them rationally and determine if there are any mortal dangers in them. If there aren't, take the plunge and confront your fears. If you are afraid of heights, go bungee jumping or skydiving. If you are afraid of snakes, go to a petting zoo and pet a non-poisonous snake. Push your limits of fear. What do you do when you have no strength to lift a heavy object? You go to the gym and build your muscles by doing the exact thing that you found you can't do, but you do it in increments. Facing manipulation is the same way. You face your fears in increments and successes until one day you are able to set yourself free. The key to attacking manipulation is taking action. Fear creates a standoff in the mind, regardless of the hazards that are responsible for them. When fear kicks in, it trips us up, and we feel weak, and that weakness leads us to being manipulated. Power of your subconscious. Communication coming from the subconscious is binary in nature. It either rewards you for the right answer or punishes you. When you get it right, you feel good. When you get it wrong, you get that nagging feeling. It's as simple as that. You've had it before, it's just that you keep calling it that nagging feeling, or as some would say, instinct. Reflection takes practice. You have to keep doing it over and over until you get the hang of it. All highly successful people do it regularly. What does this have to do with fear? What you think you are afraid of is most likely not the complete picture. To get the complete picture, or your complete fear profile, you need to engage in reflection. You need to practice reflection to the point that reflection is constantly running in the background, in parallel with everything you do. Yes, that's right, subconsciously, like a habit. Most people don't really know what they fear, and what they end up doing is being afraid of the unknown. In this case, they are afraid of the fear. The reason FDR said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," becomes more evident in this light. The most feared of all fears is the fear of uncertainty. Because when you are faced with uncertainty, any one, combination, or all of the hazards could be lurking. We just don't know. And so what we do instinctively is run for the hills, flight. We do nothing and fall into depression, freeze. Or we resort to self-destruction, anger, and abuse, fight. This is how it manifests: fight, flight, and freeze. To avoid all this, your one and only remedy, prevention, and safeguard is to be in constant reflection. To illustrate, let's assume there is a person who is suffering from the fear of commitment. If we look at the hazards, there is no hazard resembling commitment. So what does that mean? It means that the fear of commitment is a composite. It's a combination of different fears rolled into one. Here are a few examples of composite fears. Manipulation is a manifestation of fear. Fear is a condition best approached when cold. That means attempting to resolve it in the midst of a manifestation, a panic attack or bout of anxiety, is not the right time. During those times, you need to handle the symptoms. The fear that needs to be confronted is really the fruit of the 5 hazards that everyone possesses in varying degrees. It does not manifest or present itself as a physical feeling on a regular basis. Many times when it does present, it presents itself as a worry. This worry is the resonant energy of the hazard. In small doses, it is manageable. But manifestations of hazards do not stay small for long. They tend to compound and grow larger over time. When the hazard inside begins to exceed the person's ability to contain it, it manifests outwardly. The outward manifestation could be in many forms, and not all of it is directly distinguishable by the person. In some, it manifests as an eating disorder. In others, it manifests as self-destructive behavior, or possibly destructive behavior in general. It can fan latent anger, lead to depression, schizophrenia, and other mental ailments. It can even cross the mental-physical barrier and manifest as a physical disease. Chronic headaches and migraines, cancer, suppressed immune issues, bulimia, allergies, and so on. Fear is a powerful force and has a tremendous amount of energy driving it. If we can channel that energy, it has the potential to make us stronger. Remember, whatever doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. The art of dominating your fears. The obstacles we face in life, the ones that prevent us from reaching our dreams, and the ones that enslave us are never external, even though they may seem to be. They are always internal. All failure is our own doing. You must accept this fact because it is one of the most empowering truths you will ever come across. When you take responsibility for a failure, your ego will prevent you from making that mistake again. You don't want to release your fear and walk away from it. You don't want to sweep it under the carpet. You don't want to hide it in the closet. What you have to do is confront it and beat it. You want to own your naturally installed hazards and deepest fears. Because when you own them, they can't affect you negatively. They can only strengthen you. The manipulator that is controlling your life is only doing so because you allow it. Short of physical harm, there is nothing they can do psychologically if you don't allow them to. To overcome your fear, you need to dominate your hazards. To dominate your hazards, you need to observe them. Observe their nature and how they affect you. You need to look for habits that have formed from them and what their triggers are. You need to study your hazard profile and your fear profile. There is only one way to approach this, and it's through introspective reflection. Take action. Once you reflect and you slowly uncover the truth about yourself, it is time to take action against the fear. In the previous section, it was written that you do the thing that you fear. From a psychological perspective, what that does is prove the fear center's assumptions wrong. In the higher functions of the mind, which are directly connected to the hazards of the limbic system, there is an analysis of whether one has the competence to conduct a task. That competence is mostly underestimated, and that then triggers the fear center into freezing. The key to overcome this is to go ahead and do the task, a small part of it. When the task is completed successfully, it shows confidence, which in turn results in a little more confidence. This is one incremental step that should be followed by another. When the next task is successful, more confidence is built, and that leads to taking the next higher step. This is called the competence-confidence loop. There is one catch, though. The opening position of this loop is a total lack of confidence, which freezes the system and renders the person incapable of any ability to make an attempt. The only way to break the cycle is to take action. Once you take action and gain competence, you can gain confidence and keep escalating until there is no fear whatsoever. The ability to fear external threats came about to protect the species and life in general. But the world has changed. While the game of predator and prey may still play out in the Serengeti the way it did millions of years ago in the wild, the stage has changed for the human species. Fear, which was once our protection, is now, in many modern scenarios, a hurdle. When fear debilitates us to the point of inaction, it's a problem. When fear freezes us into capitulation, it's a problem. When fear shakes us, it's a problem. But we are not without recourse. It's time to take stock of what we know and the steps to take to break the binds that have kept success at bay. Fear is a powerful force that can derail us from an otherwise stellar destiny. Everything from fear of spiders to separation anxiety to fear of superstitions can be consciously debilitating, or worse, subconsciously sabotaging. You are not successful as you want to be today because of the latent and subconscious fears you have harbored, which are anchored by the hazards we all possess. To navigate your path to success, you need to weigh anchor. All you have to do is acknowledge their existence and move on. That's how you get over them. Acknowledge the root of the fear, analyze the assumptions, then act. If you fail the first time, act again. Keep committing the act until success emerges. Do not harbor fear of failure, but be afraid of not trying. The fear of failure is prospective. It's something that may happen in the future, but it is debilitating to your present. To break what may happen later, act now. Repurpose that fear. Instead of allowing fear to freeze you, fear not giving it your all. Fear inaction. Fear complacency. But remember that you now know the one and only counterattack to fear: action. Take action to counter ego death. Take action to counter all the hazards, and you will find that each time you do, your confidence increases. Fear, it turns out, when balanced, is a powerful ally in the game of survival. So if you think you've got a fear problem, turn it into strength and do exactly what you fear. Elicit the aid of a coach or a friend to guide you as you take baby steps and ascend the competence-confidence loop. It really is like riding a bike. In the grand scheme of things, there is no such thing as right and wrong. There is only consequence. So do not be afraid of making a mistake. In the grand scheme, there is no such thing as failure. There is only the failure to try. In the grand scheme of things, there is nothing to fear except fear itself. In the grand scheme of things, you have the power to decide what controls your destiny. Will it be your freedom or your fears? The hazards inside you that are orchestrating your myriad of fears are based on the instinct for survival, and that is antiquated. It has no relevance in our present situation. If you don't believe that, look at the freeze instinct of a deer in the headlights. Evolution dictates that freezing would ensure survival. Sure it will, if it's against a larger predator, but not against a speeding truck on a dark highway. We have moved so far ahead of what other species and even ourselves have evolved to that we need our rational mind to wrest control from the instinct to freeze and to fear. You cannot be that deer in the headlights the next time opportunity presents itself. Take it, act on it, own it. Make mistakes if you have to, but you no longer need to fear it. Once you do this, no one can dictate the terms of your actions. That brings any attempt to manipulate you to an end. Once you reach this point, you should then stand up and forgive those who tried to manipulate you, because it is your ultimate show of strength. Only the weak harbor the desire for revenge. The strong do not, and you are strong. Conclusion. Over the course of this book, we have seen the elements and profiles of what it means to be emotionally manipulative, how we can see it coming, and how we can detect it in our own lives. Part of the insidious nature of manipulation is that it either can't be detected or it is detected and can't be rebuffed. Both are equally problematic, and it is so ingrained in the fabric of relationships that some victims even feel they are at fault for feeling that way. The key here that we want you to take away from this book is that you are not the victim, no matter how it is termed and what people say. This is not just wishful thinking or hyperbole. This is a straight fact and a way out of being manipulated. You are indeed not the victim, because you can make the decision at any time you wish to throw it all away. This only works if there is no threat of physical harm to you or your loved ones. If it is purely emotional manipulation, then you need to fix the emotion that is being tugged on to manipulate you and bolster that emotion or shut it off. You must remember the emotional manipulation framework that we talked about, and you need to fit the manipulation that you think is afoot in that framework. If it fits that framework, then you know that what your subconscious has been telling you is on the mark. No matter what books or therapists offer as a diagnosis, the best person to understand if you are being manipulated is you. Not even the manipulator knows this as well as you. This knowledge starts with a spark deep within you. If that spark ignites, you will end up doing things like you are doing right now, going in search of information and coming across this book. So your inclinations are already intrigued, and you need to find more. That is an excellent start. In the process of discovery, as you are in now, it is best to look inside without any shadow of guilt. Guilt will do you no good and will only serve as fodder for the manipulator. You need to be guiltless, but look within. Most people do not advocate looking within, and nobody wants to look inside to find their strength, because they mistakenly believe that looking within victimizes the person even more. It doesn't. It empowers you. It empowers you to admit that you were weak, and now you are on the way to being strong. It empowers you to admit that you were once mistaken, but now you are on your way.